So we're going to read from the beginning of Luke's account of the life of Jesus. Both Luke and Matthew add birth stories or preludes to their symphonies of Jesus' life. And I think, once again, we need to remember that these stories were not written for us. They were written for a particular culture, for a particular set of ears, using language and symbolism that would have struck a chord deep within the listeners. So, the best stories don't need to be explained, but they do. So I'm going to invite you to consider this story as like a parable. Something that is going to shake us if we hear the truth of it. In the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah. His wife was a descendant of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Both of them were righteous before God, living blameless, according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. But they had no children, because Elizabeth was barren, and both were getting on in years. Remember back in the essay writing days, how far back do you have to go for that? Number one rule, get your point out in the first paragraph. Well, Luke does just this. Setting the stage is an old couple with perfect pedigrees. Zechariah is a priest. Elizabeth is a descendant of Aaron, the firstborn of the priestly class. Righteous folk. Perfect folk. Blameless, in fact. Yet old and barren. Can you hear the irony in that? You're supposed to. These two had met all the standards demanded by their religious tradition. They were, in fact, poster children, but they were barren. It's an interesting word, barren. We know that word, don't we? We, too, have experienced seasons of barrenness. It is a word that is akin to hopelessness. In that culture, if you wanted to talk about hopelessness, then you told the story of barrenness. Because in that culture, children were the future, and without them, there was no future. But remember that Luke is telling a cosmic story here, not just a little snippet of history. And can you hear the hints that are intended to disarm those who hear the story like a parable? Meant to create some dissonance in the hearer. Perfect, obedient, righteous folk, yet hopeless. That should make you a little nervous. That is, if you are perfect, obedient, and righteous. So you'll all be fine. Because we aren't, are we? And so this is going to be a great story. Once when Zechariah was serving as priest before God and his section was on duty, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to enter the sanctuary of the Lord and offer incense. Now at the time the incense offering, the whole assembly of people was praying outside. I've been listening to this BBC podcast on the history of sacred fire. Every faith tradition acknowledges fire as a symbol and a sign of the mystery. Burning bush, example. The Judaic Christian tradition is not the only one with a burning bush. And within the temple, the priests took turns to draw lots and to go into the Holy of Holies to tend the fire. Only the priests were allowed to enter. So there is a little bit more irony here. We have the hopeless Zechariah, the hopeless Holy One, is sent in to tend the fire. Then there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was terrified, and fear overwhelmed him. But the angel said, "Do not be afraid, for your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will name him John. And he will turn many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God." Now remember, the story was not written for our ears. It was written for that early Christian community that was primarily Jewish, who would have heard the story of an old barren couple and gone, "Here we go again." It is an archetype within the Jewish tradition. The story of the people of Israel begins with the story of Abraham and Sarah, who in their 90s have a son. It is, of course, an impossible tale, which is why you need to listen deeply for its invitation. It is an invitation, I think, to trust our ability to birth a new story. And what happens next is a bit of an amendment to the Sarah story. Remember when Sarah was told by the stranger that she would bear a son, she laughed with disbelief. And her son, called Isaac, meant laughter. This story is a bit different. Zechariah said to the angel, "How will I know that this is so? For I am an old man, and my wife is getting on in years." The angel replied, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. But now, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time, you will become mute, unable to speak until the day that these things occur." So, you're not quite sure whether to laugh or to cry here. Laugh because poor old Zechariah, who slaves away, tending the holy fire, cannot ever imagine being fired up himself. So the angel is a bit cheeky. Fine. The best thing ever to happen to you, and you will not be able to share it because you have become too comfortable with hopelessness. Or there's a different reading, a recognition that we often become comfortable with hopelessness and refuse to be ignited by fire. In fact, cannot see the new story that might be right in front of us. Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondered at his delay. When he did come out, he could not speak to them, and they realized that he had seen a vision. He kept motioning to them and remained unable to speak. After those days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months, she remained in seclusion. She said, "This is what the Lord has done for me when he looked favorably on me and took away the disgrace I have endured among my people." There is a cultural detail here worth noting. Childlessness was considered to be a curse from God, which was a double whammy. Really, not only do you not have a future, but God does not like you. Shame on you. So let's back away from the characters just a bit, because this story is bigger than them, or else it is not big enough. Luke opens the story of Jesus with 2 pregnancies. The parable of these pregnancies has very little to do with the union between a man and a woman, and everything to do with the union between God and humanity. These stories are intended to help us understand the human-God relationship very differently. Why? Because the teaching of Jesus challenged the way that his tradition understood that relationship. In fact, the theology that is operative in these 2 pregnancy stories, this one and then Mary, is meant to reinforce the kind of glasses that Jesus provided for rethinking divinity. And the story begins by challenging the operative theology of the day. 2 very religious people, obedient to God, and their lives had nothing to show for it, which flew in the face of everything that everyone thought was true. If you were good, God would be good to you. If you were suffering hardship, well, you had obviously offended God, and now you were paying the price. This is the kind of challenge to theology that Jesus made. Because what that theology results in, then, is hopelessness. But much worse than that, you've then reduced the sacred fire to, he's making a list, he's checking it twice, he's going to find out who's naughty and nice. And when you reduce the sacred fire to the God who wags his finger, well, that too is a recipe for barrenness. Now, you may be thinking, we don't believe that anymore. But I hear shades of that kind of theology just about wherever I turn. And so Zechariah, who has tended the sacred fire all his working life, cannot translate that fire into hope, because it has been reduced to ritual at best and a resolution to live in shame at worst. And the deeper irony is that those from the priestly class in this parable represent the hopelessness of it all. But Zechariah and Elizabeth are symbols, right? They are symbols for Israel. They are symbols for us all. The story is meant to be an invitation for a new season within the life of Israel, a season that takes the fire out of the Holy of Holies, far away from anyone else, and puts that fire into the belly of an old, barren woman. Because it's Israel whose life has become barren, whose priests reduced the sacred fire to a set of rituals and laws which create a community that is exclusive and oppressive and hopeless. And then for centuries, as the church grew into an institution, it kind of did the same thing. So the greater invitation, as we begin a season devoted to pregnancy, is that we recognize that the sacred fire symbolized by this tiny flame of hope is rooted in our humanity. It's growing in us. This season is rife with poetry and song and story, all inviting us to carry the sacred fire in our bellies, calling us to be tiny flames of hope for one another. That is what it means. Emmanuel, God with us, in our belly, on fire. Listen to the reflection on that fire as it burned in Helen Keller. Words by Langston Hughes. She, in the dark, found light, brighter than many ever see. She, within herself, found loveliness through the soul's own mastery, and now the world receives from her dower the message of the strength of inner power. Throughout this time for contemplation, I invite you to consider how you will burn as a candle of hope this season. Who needs to warm themselves at your fire? Who needs their own hope ignited by your grace? Or are you so discouraged, so afraid, that like Zechariah, you cannot imagine the fire making its way within you?